So we teach them to detect what an anxious thought feeling looks like or feels like, or they can detect, oh, I'm anxious. So they learn how to detect it and they can count 1, 2, 3, 4 times of an anxious thought. It could be a positive or a negative feeling. It could be a confident, it could be all sorts of feelings. But one thing that we do want to do is we want to have a fair pair. So if you want to have a behavior that we want to decrease, we also want to have a behavior that might seem like it's opposite that we want to increase as well.
It's exceptionally hard for us as a verbal community to teach what's going on inside you. And again, some people just are so uncomfortable with that. They'd rather be a methodological behaviorist and not even deal with it and figure out, well, how do we teach someone? What's the difference? If we just talk about depression, there's a lot of things that make we feel sad, we feel lonely. Like, what does that spectrum look like when we say depression, and what are these specific targets?
Hey, really quick before we start, Cooperant Learning is a project of Sparks Behavioral Services, LLC, an ACE-approved continuing education provider for BCBAs. If you'd like to get continuing education credits for this or many of our other episodes, check out cooperantlearning.com. There you're going to look for the episode, complete a short quiz about the content discussed, and a certificate will be given to you right there in your dashboard. You can also sign up for our email list for updates on the latest episodes, coupon codes, and courses we offer. And of course, follow us on social media like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, the whole 9 yards. Okay, that's all. Enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cooperant Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Steery. With me, as always, is Steve Sparks. I've been saying Dr. Sparks, but you said it sounded like a kid's dentist. So.
No, Dr. Steve sounded like a kid's dentist. Dr. Sparks to you, but everybody else can call me Steve. That's fine.
Fair. I'll call you. I'm going to come up with a new nickname, I think, for every show. That might be a shtick that we have.
Works. I noticed I tried to sign on today and it had my camera locked out. My microphone wasn't working. Now I'm like, I just have a feeling you're trying to phase me out here somehow.
Yeah.
We'll just see how this goes.
It's from the inside. I'm going to allude to nothing, but there's a slow takeover going on. So
I've been told that from the other companies as well. So
Steve and I just got back from BAM, as well as a lot of folks from Sparks Behavioral Services. I had a good time at BAM.
Lots of fun. Said hi to Rick while we were there, who was joining us here today. So that was cool.
Oh, you broke the ice. I was going to do an introduction, but that's
you
cool.
Still can do it, but otherwise it's just awkward. We're talking about a place he was like he wasn't there.
That's true. It was nice meeting you, Rick, though. And on that note, why don't I introduce you guys? We have two great guests today.
Nobody's here for us, all right?
That's true. We talk very quickly so we can get on to the good stuff here. But they are the authors of Measuring Change in Private Events, a review of precision teaching interventions for inner behavior. This was out in the February 2026 edition of Behavior and Social Issues. Doctors Jared Van and Rick Kubina, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Jared, I'll start with you. Anybody who's unfamiliar, doesn't know you want to introduce yourself and tell everyone kind of what you're up to?
Yeah, my name is Jared Van, Dr. Jared Van. I'm really into precision teaching. I'm into improving our learning outcomes for our students. And I'm a professor at the Chicago School for the ABA program for the distance learning side of it. And I also do content creation online on TikTok and Instagram when it comes to whether it's Black history, precision teaching, behavior analysis, all sorts of things that I just find interesting. I even made stuff about comic books recently because I'm a big comic book nerd, as is Rick.
Man, I'm going to be really tempted to talk comic books, but we're not going to go down that road, at least until we're done recording. Well, thanks for being on, Jared. And then Dr. Kubina.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rick Kubina. I'm a professor at Penn State University. I'm also the director of research at Central Reach. And my path to Central Reach came from being an entrepreneur at Penn State. I created a technology with a business partner called Chartlytics. That was acquired back in 2018. Now it's called Precision X. And I would say within the last 10 years, my career, maybe a little more than that, has decidedly changed and shifted into looking at how do we marry behavior analysis and many things that we do with that with technology. So I've done work with robots. I've done work with AI. But like Jared, there are things that I'm still interested in the precision teaching world, and I continue to do work there.
So this paper was had to do with measuring private events. I thought it'd be a good kind of starting point to maybe start on the historical context of private events and the differences between methodological behaviorists and the radical behaviorism that Skinner started. This might be a little bit of review for some people, but it might lay some good groundwork. So, does anybody want to speak to kind of what private events and how that laid into the radical behaviors framework?
Well, I think both of us are so deep into this that either one of us could talk about it. But I started back with my master's degree at Ohio State, so my lineage is with Cooper, Heron, and Heward. Those guys, those are my guys, and at Ohio State. So back in 90, when was it? 92 to 93 is when I got my master's degree, and I started doing work then. And that's really when I started to learn more about behavior analysis and what you talked about, the difference between public and private events. Private events are simply behaviors that occur within the skin. Those were Skinner's words. And he said that the skin should never be a barrier. And the way we understand the science of behavior and the way it works with the things that we can see doesn't stop working in the ways that we can't see. So behavior analysis in this world that lives within all of us is, these are private events. And Skinner wrote papers back in, I remember 45, he had this famous paper where he talked about, if I have a toothache, is that behavior any less real than shaking a hand? I mean, he didn't say shaking a hand. I forget what he actually said, but that was the idea. And it really attracted me to this discipline even more, that understanding private events is what he wrote about for years was, look, we need to look at this, what's happening inside of us to understand it just as well as we're understanding publicly facing behavior. So a short definition is private events occur within your skin, and radical behaviorism, methodological behaviorism, that's like a long story too.
Sure.
But we could cover it if you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. I mean, if you'd like to, yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's an abridged version or
I think I
if
got an
that
abridged
did it.
version of
Yeah, go for it, Jared.
radical. So radical behaviorists believe that you can both private behavior and behavior that is observable to all individuals are behaviors that we can measure, that we could change and stuff like that. Whereas methodological behaviorists are like, no, can't see it, you can't measure it. And to those, I think there are a lot of people that say that they're radical behaviorists, because a lot of us do. But I think that a lot of people are closeted methodological behaviorists. And to them, I'm saying stuff like, oh, I see you have a ring on your finger. Do you love your wife? I mean, how do you know that? I kind of like to poke the bear and just kind of get them to kind of engage in like, okay, well, we have these feelings, these thoughts, these urges, all of these things that are happening within the skin. I think it is within our analysis of behavior to find how to measure and change them to make us and allow us to live better and more fulfilled lives.
One of my favorite techniques when someone outside our field or inside our field says something about like, well, I don't know about, that internal behavior stuff. I ask them, okay, what language do you think in? All right, now, how did you think before you knew that language? Because that is the behavior learned at that point. And I think that tends to catch people off guard a little bit when you present it that way.
I've presented a lot on inner behaviors, what we call it in precision teaching. Private events is what it's known as in behavior analysis. And I have suffered many slings and arrows. I'm not asking for any sympathy here, but like Jared was saying, there are so many people that are comfortable with being a methodological behavior analyst. And once you start talking about private events, they're like, whoa, we can't talk about that. And then, people have called me like a cognitivist, and I'm like, you can't find a more radical behaviorist than me. Well, okay, maybe that's a brag. I have been a radical behaviorist for as long as I understood the science. I've tried to practice its tenets, and the way we do things, and if you look at, as we're going to talk more, about ways that you can examine behavior inside the skin is incredibly important for us to embrace as a science. Because if we don't, people who are methodological behaviorists, they just want to seed this whole thing to other branches of science. And we've all seen how good like cognitive psychology has done. And again, not disparaging them, but they look at the world very differently than we do. And if we look at effectiveness and measuring a behavior change, defining it, it's very different. And it's not just, I don't have to pick on them. There's many different disciplines out there that view the world differently. And they've tried to do things and they haven't been successful. We, in large scale, haven't tried to do things in that area, which I feel is a great opportunity, even to this day, that we need to explore.
Yeah, I'm always willing to be a little bit controversial, and I'll say those techniques in other fields tend to work quite well. But at least in our state, when severe behavior isn't affected by those other techniques, we are the ones they come to. And so I often point out that maybe it's not that there isn't an overlap, but we just talk about things so differently. And it's kind of a one size fits all with some of those therapies that we reinvent the wheel and it just works a little bit better.
Yeah.
Along those lines, private events, as you mentioned in the paper, are kind of an enigma for a lot of different disciplines. You mentioned neuroscience particularly, and I liked how you worded that about correlational data with the findings in neuroscience. Neuroscience or related disciplines, have they contributed to our understanding of any sort of causal relationship between, negative thoughts, private events, things like that? I know you talk a lot about there's a lot of correlates between private events and a lot of mental health diagnoses as well.
I'll let you go
Uh,
for it
I,
first.
I'll say that we have to be very cautious when it comes to causality, especially with private events. And this is one of the areas where people not familiar with the work that Jared and I have done, we're not looking at inner behavior as causal. In the past, there's introspection. And when people did introspection early in psychology, they were looking at their thoughts, they were diagramming them, they were looking for causality in these introspective events. If you just look at a behavior and you're tacting something and you're just counting it, that's a piece of data that you can examine, and we have interventions that can affect that. We're not saying why it's being affected. We're not putting it in a 3-term contingency. We're doing none of those things. We're just saying, look, if you have these certain private events, which you would have to define, which right away you could probably see the hackles of people going up. Well, how are you going to get IOA on that? Well, you're not. And people just have very strong objections that if you can't have IOA, then you can't have a legitimate scientific target. But you can. There's so many things that we every single day that everybody does. So, Steve, when you were talking about confronting people, every day we talk to ourselves. We have pains. There's all these things that go on that we're very comfortable talking about, and we don't discount them. We don't say that they're not there. So I don't want to rant on this because I could, and I have many times before, but your question's a good one. When you start looking outside of our discipline and people who are adjacent to behavior analysis, they do have ways of collecting data and they do have ways of interpreting it. And what's really interesting, if you start going down deep down the rabbit hole, what you actually see with some of this neurological data is instances where they, again, throw a bomb out there, talk about free will. Some of these neurological studies show, look, we don't have free will according to this neurological data. And so depending on what kind of data that you're looking at, I wouldn't say that, at least in my research that I've done, and Jared, maybe this is different from the things that you look at, I haven't seen direct correlative data to what we're doing. So I don't have a good answer to that part of your question.
I agree. I think it's important for me to start off by saying I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not trained in neuroscience, but I have reviewed papers and tried to understand what are they learning, what are they doing, what are they seeing, and when they see behavioral correlates for what's going on in the brain and what's going on outside the body, sometimes we get that dualism that we kind of might have issues with when it comes to our science. So I'm like, okay, how can we couch what we need to do, which is measure private behavior and change it in our science? How can we make this work for us? And I think that's what we did in the paper, and what we explain in the paper, and say that neuroscience is going to, I think, in the future, be able to help us, but we have to get together with what we can do first before we can really connect the dots in a way that's going to be extremely beneficial for everybody, especially since we can't walk around with like nodes on our heads all day
Right,
and
right,
be able
right.
to measure those things as they occur.
Yeah, I've always thought of it as almost two sides of the same coin. We know neurologically activity is going on that you could say that may be causal, but we also know if you can control the contingencies well enough that that is causing or controlling the behavior in the moment as well. And so I've always thought it'd be interesting to map on some responses based on some environmental stimuli so you can kind of get an idea of what's going on in the brain, then kind of pair or teach a novel response that is associated with those same stimuli and see if you can actually map on and see where operant conditioning is occurring neurologically with that, because we know those neurological connections are being made during the learning process, but where does that, like, is it actually something you could actually see and map on perfectly, or are there too many stimuli and too many things going on that it would kind of just be a big mess sort of thing? I think that would be interesting to see if we could find neurologists willing to work with us on that.
You mentioned IOA, Rick, and kind of getting into the paper here a little bit. In your review, you drew distinction between self-reporting and self-counting. Can you talk about the difference between like a self-report and a self-count, and what the implications for those two terms might be as far as data quality and data interpretation might be?
Yeah. So when you're self-reporting, you're describing the experience, how it occurred, how it felt, all of these things that we often see either on rating scales like Likert scales from a scale of like 1 to 7. And then when it comes to reporting, just what was going on in the environment. Now, that is one thing. But when we talk about self-counting, we're talking about measuring directly the amount of times a behavior occurs. That's what we do in our science. We measure the amount of times a behavior occurs. We put it on a chart, we give a visual analysis, and then we try to change it across time via our interventions. So, by measuring the outer behavior, we can apply interventions to change the intervention. So, what we do is we take the inner behavior and take an intervention and try to change what the measurement is, and see the changes in level, trend, and variability. And when we talk about trend on precision teaching, we're talking about acceleration, and we're talking about variability in precision teaching. We're talking about bounce, the way that those dots and X's bounce on the chart up and down. And when we see that there is a functional effect, we can be able to determine that our intervention had some effect, and then we can do replications and see, okay, let's do this more and see and get more information. So that difference in reporting just what experienced, what it felt like and what happened, versus saying this is how many times it occurred within this amount of time, and then seeing if we can change environmental contingencies to reduce or increase that number.
Very good. And then I think I know the answer to this question, but why is achieving a reliable measurement versus something like rating scales versus like those anecdotal reports, things like that? Why is that critical, in your opinion and in your research, to developing behavior analytic interventions that target private events?
Yeah, a rating scale is a summative qualitative judgment of something. So, did you have a good day today? 1 to 5. 1, I had a really shitty day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you're fine. Don't tell Google.
5, I had an amazing day, and then you put the numbers in between. So, oh yeah, I had a 5. Today was an amazing day. That's a qualitative assessment and you rating something. that could be your feelings of the day or whatever. Whereas when we look at counts, that is an individual tally of something that we are counting. And very different when we look at when it comes to reliability. Yes, you could say, okay, am I qualitatively doing that? Whereas if we have a count, everything that we know in our field, one of the attractive features of behavior analysis that has always impressed me is our adherence to strong data. We have all these phrases about behavior counts and so on, how important data is. And I love that because it's the same thing. If you just have a rating scale, that's a one-time measure, it's summative. Whereas if I have a count of something, whether it's for an hour, 2 hours, all day, then the next day you can start looking at, and when you have this data that's a pattern, you can look for variability, you can look for the level, you can look for the trend. And when you have that, that's exceptionally different from just a rating scale. And yes, there are issues, and Jared can speak about this because we've done a lot of research in terms of reliability and who you work with. We work with some young children, and we have reliability issues. And we've worked with adults. Do we not know we have reliability issues? Like, some people are like, well, what if people were just lying? And what if they're putting things like, sure, that can happen. We have no way of disproving, but there are tells when you look at the data. And if you look at so much data, if people are lying, we can actually detect that with because we're putting all this data on a standard acceleration chart. We understand the range of patterns that should emerge. And if someone's just phoning it in and taking their data, we can have a guess, but can we prove it? Of course not.
And I
So
think that there's one thing real quick that I'm not gonna I want to preview. When you're counting and measuring things directly, like this happened 1, 2, 3, 4 times. One thing that people do without even learning about ABC data collection is they start noticing the environmental contingencies that are occurring during and after that behavior occurs. So you're kind of seeing, okay, this happened then. What happened to make that happen? And people, like I said, that haven't been taught ABC data recording, they start noticing those things. So as we get further, that's going to be important.
Does it kind of add some salience to those episodes?
what kind of responses are you measuring in this? I mean, like, could you give an example? I'm kind of thinking almost like using Likert scales, kind of almost like asking someone to recount something they did, like in the witness box, where you know there's going to be a lack of reliability versus an actual instance. Are you talking about, all right, here's the find of a depressive behavior or something like that, and now you're taking in an accurate count that way? Or what kind of behavior are you actually looking at in this type of research?
Good question. It all depends on the individual and what kind of behavior we want to increase or decrease. So we'll start with, maybe they feel high levels of anxiety. They report that they're feeling high levels of anxiety. So we teach them to detect what an anxious thought feeling looks like or feels like, or they can detect, oh, I'm anxious. So they learn how to detect it, and they can count 1, 2, 3, 4 times of an anxious thought. It could be a positive or a negative feeling. It could be a confident. It could be all sorts of feelings. But one thing that we do want to do is we want to have a fair pair. So if you want to have a behavior that we want to decrease, we also want to have a behavior that might seem like it's opposite that we want to increase as well. So inner behavior is under the umbrella of private behavior. And inner behavior is consisted of thoughts, feelings, and urges. The first inner behavior intervention was done by Ogden Lindsley when he was measuring his urges to smoke cigarettes. And I love showing that chart because he realized later that he was measuring urges. So he started measuring his urges, and you see this big spike on the chart. And it's like, oh, I wonder what happened there. And he went to a conference and he actually ended up smoking because he was measuring the number of times he smoked and the amount of urges. So the urges got really high. He ended up smoking. So it's really, really interesting to see that. Hopefully in the future we get more research on urges, because I think it could help us investigate ways to help when it comes to addiction, compulsions, and stuff like that.
Jared has done a great lit review and just a lot of work with his dissertation and the things that he's publishing. And going over some of those articles, there's a wide range of different targets that people look at. There's depressive thoughts, there are confident thoughts, there are loving thoughts. There's a whole range of these. But again, if you were looking at this body of literature, it's small, and it's shamefully small for, I feel, for behavior analysis. And that is, let's take something like post-traumatic stress syndrome. You have people that have experienced some type of traumatic event. Maybe there's been some abuse, or there's something really uh, horrible that happened to them, and now they have these intense thoughts. They have flashbacks, but there are these things that are happening inside them which are incredibly troublesome. Where's our interventions for like, what are we doing to help them with their thoughts? And I've had conversations with people like, well, you need to deal with the external behavior. So, are they laying down? Are they depressive? One of the things that we've learned in precision teaching is that outer behaviors and inner behaviors are independent of one another. And it makes sense when you start thinking about verbal behavior and what it really is. And being able to have interventions that look at working with these very specific types of behaviors uh, is incredibly important. And not just PTSD, there's many other things that we could do as behavior analysis. Now, one of the problems that you're going to run into is what Skinner noted in his paper. It's exceptionally hard for us as a verbal community to teach what's going on inside you. And again, some people just are so uncomfortable with that. They'd rather be a methodological behaviorist and not even deal with it and figure out, well, how do we teach someone? What's the difference? If we just talk about depression, there's a lot of things that make we feel sad, we feel lonely. Like, what does that spectrum look like when we say depression, and what are these specific targets? And if we're running a multiple baseline or whatever, is Jared's thought and what he's tacking different from what I'm doing? And again, I get people being uncomfortable with that, but that should not stop us from looking into this, running experiments, and then ramping that up, because it's such a critical area of human existence that we need to address as behavior analysts.
Sure.
Yeah. To go a little bit more down the rabbit hole, and Kyle's job is to keep us on track, and mine is to derail us constantly. Did you say independent or interdependent between the verbal behavior and the external behavior?
Independent.
Okay. Because I definitely agree and see that internal verbal behavior oftentimes is, we do, I think, work with a lot of people who, would have a traumatic event, exhibit a lot of target behavior like that. And we're having to determine, okay, how can we shape some of the internal verbal behavior through their external verbal behavior, while also working on the skills and trying to control the environment. So, assumingly it's avoidance or escape maintain behavior often when there's some stimulus in the environment, but we see a lot of times it becomes attention maintained or even tangibly maintained over time because of that fear response and the verbal community around them reinforcing it, and now it becomes more of an issue. Is that kind of what you're talking about, with there being kind of the separate, where you need to try to address the internal verbal behavior that may be causing ongoing anxiety or depression, but also the external contingencies that might be controlling some of the other behavior as well, and kind of get those to line up? Or do you mean it's independent in terms of, I guess, what might you mean by that?
I would consider those independent. So when we talk about anxiety, there are things that people will exhibit publicly. That's one way of looking at behavior. But then there's these anxious thoughts. And this is what Jared and I looked at. That's very different. And if we think about people in any type of situation, imagine that you're calm, you're going through your day without showing anything, but yet you have 500 instances of a particular behavior. You're just a wreck of things that are going on, and you're really suffering, but you're not showing it externally. So, and it could be vice versa in thinking about it. So these have to be looked at separately.
Okay. Yeah, I've kind of conceptualized over the years that generalized anxiety disorder does mean literal generalization. You know, the stimuli involved in some sort of anxiety provoking, situation that now, because there's similarities between one stimulus and another, and then another, and another, it's literally causing this generalization where you have anxiety in other situations now, but that may not fit the environment. And so that kind of seems to be along those same lines of that becomes more and more of a disconnect depending on what may be reinforcing that behavior as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good opportunity for us to look into ways to see, okay, you're counting when this is occurring. Now describe to us what the environmental contingencies were when that behavior occurred, or when that inner behavior occurred, and which is where we need more research. I mean, this is the limitation of the dearth of research that is currently available. And looking into exactly what you're talking about, Dr. Sparks, is something that I think that we should do.
Yeah,
There you
it's
go,
really
Steve.
unfortunate because we have well, 200, 300 clients in the state of Michigan with a lot of these type behaviors, yet they're in settings and we don't necessarily have the staffing to collect the data and really explore it the way we want to as a science, because there's that disconnect there as well. As the system won't pay us to do this. They just want you to go in there and stop them from hurting themselves or others. And, we're trying to just help people. And whether or not we're getting good data from the primary caregivers or not, we always kind of just assume in session we can get some good data. Out of session, hopefully it's consistently inconsistent, at least maybe only 60% consistent, with fidelity, but hopefully it's always around 60% across, for that consumer. That sort of thing is kind of the best we have. So I think hearing the way you are measuring it rather than relying on others to measure it could maybe help bridge some of that gap and help us explain things a little bit more clearly, and what we're seeing, rather than, all right, we know it's verbal behavior, we know how behavior is shaped, so let's shape and build some new skills and change some of those contingencies around it and hopefully help their life that way.
To that point, Connie in the chat said, I wonder if this also could be used as an indirect measure of social validity. If we're measuring private events during certain procedures, this may help guide future treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a cool idea. One of the things that I chose to do in the study that's going to come out soon, when it came to measuring the anxiety of middle schoolers, which was my dissertation topic, I also not only had the quantitative counts of the anxious thoughts and feelings, I also spoke with them before and after the intervention, and I did a kind of interview and I talked with them about, hey, what's going on? How did you feel before? And then how did you feel after? Did you feel any change? And I know I was told that by some students, like I wouldn't raise my hand or participate much in class, and now I'm participating more in class. One student just said he had better grades overall after. I can't say that it was the study itself that did that, but I mean, it was nice to hear. And there were a lot of different things that they had to say that if I only got that number, it wouldn't be as full as if I had asked them, what also did you experience and what was easy or what was difficult, so that we can improve these interventions moving forward for other students and participants.
Yeah, Jared also uncovered some interesting findings, which I hadn't seen before. He had taken on his research. And one of those is in some of the social validity questions, where when students' behavior changed, they would say things very differently from what we were seeing in the data. And that was really interesting. Like, okay, you're self-counting that's going down, but you're saying, I don't think it really did anything for me. So that I thought was intriguing.
Yeah, especially with that was when you work with males that are talking about their feelings. I think that in our society, we're not often taught to have a metacognition about our feelings, to say, a bad term, but to really, engage with what we're feeling and thinking. Whereas some of the girls that I worked with, they said that they were better able to, or at least they were better able to explain what was going on. Whereas the males kind of talked about what was going on with their lives instead of what was just going on with their heads.
Do you think it has anything to do with just the salience of the change as well? I'm thinking over time, maybe you may not notice as much of a change. Kind of like I think about going to the eye doctor, like which is better, one or two, one or two. I'm like, I don't know. Let's say two. You know what I mean? And so, if in each individual step is a very small improvement, but over time you could look at the data and see it. Do you think that might be kind of what's going on with some of that as well?
Yeah, I think so. We definitely did our study for a shorter amount of time when it came to my dissertation. So I think that doing things for a longer period of time would definitely be helpful. Additionally, it's difficult for, you're in middle school, you're going through puberty, you're going through all these changes, you're trying to deal with class and all these other things. So you may not have developmentally been able to work to understand what's going on to be able to explain it well to a researcher who's like taking notes and recording you just taking what you say. So this is why we need more research to better understand like how much is needed, what's going on. And I think one of the really good ones was done by actually Cooper, who had an article in 1991, "Can This Marriage Be Saved?"
Mm.
It's an incredible article because it's only one page of text, then a chart, and it talks about him, experiencing thoughts and feelings that he didn't want, and then he used an inner behavior intervention to change the frequency of those inner behaviors.
Yeah, I still think even as a now 40-year-old adult male, if someone asks me how I'm doing, I have to stop and think like, I don't know. I didn't think about it today. How am I doing?
Fine.
I guess. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's always just good. Yep,
Yeah.
we're good. Or, yeah, yeah. That I don't remember what I was going to say. That we're good.
Oh, you're good. You're good. It's I have two middle schoolers. I don't know if there's any punishment worse than having to go through middle school again. So I definitely can see that. I want to get to the paper too, because you asked some good questions in your literature review. Um, the the first question we kind of answered is what dependent variables have researchers identified and measured when it comes to measuring private events and targets using standard acceleration charts and PT. The second question: what interventions have been used to alter the frequency of these rates? I wanted to ask a what you kind of found in the literature, and b kind of I'm having trouble conceptualizing what I just maybe it's just my learning history with precision teaching. I always think of it in an academic format, and I always think of it, 1 minute timings, fluency checks, things like that. And I know there's more to it. So maybe describing what PT kind of looks like in terms of targeting private events.
Yeah. So when we're targeting private events, what we're doing is during baseline, we're first learning how to detect and measure the private event, right? Because like you said, sometimes it can be hard to say like, how was my day? You know what I mean? So if I'm saying
Hmm.
I want to measure the amount of times I have depressive thoughts and feelings, and I want to have happy thoughts and feelings. Let's try to work on measuring those two. So we first build some fluency with being able to just all day trying to figure out counting and doing that. Then you feel comfortable counting. So then you just count all day during baseline and see where you're at, what level you're at. And then when we go into intervention, we introduce the 1 minute timing where you try to introduce the desired behavior that you want to increase. Say it's positive feelings, say it's confident feelings, happy feelings, whatever. For 1 minute, you try to think of as many happy, confident feelings as you can. And honestly, I have people do this when I teach this or when I do presentations, and it's really hard the first time to come up with
Yeah.
positive self statements about yourself that it's like, oh man, I didn't realize I only got 12 in 1 minute. That's kind of where I started. And then as you build, you're able to say more kind things to yourself over time. And that goes to you being able to say more kind things about and to yourself over time throughout the day. So that fluency timing is helping you build that repetition, but then it also can be able to generalize to other opportunities and events. Because I did this on myself. And one of the things that I noticed is that I was able to, one, play basketball better because I had more confidence when I was measuring my positives. And then somebody said something to me that I knew would usually hurt me, but I felt like I had a shield up. And I was like, oh no, I'm amazing. I'm smart. I'm dope. I have great hair. I'm fantastic. I can dunk. Like all these things like came up to my head and I was like, you can't hurt me like you used to. So I had
Yeah.
that protective thing. So when we do our 1 minute timings, we often see a deceleration in undesired behavior, whether that's anxious thoughts, depressive thoughts, sad thoughts, and then we usually see acceleration in the desired thoughts, right? And we see those all day because we're still counting all day of how many positive and negative thoughts we're having, and then we're doing that 1 minute timing as well to do that frequency building where we're trying to increase the number we can. So all you do is and historically, it's been one time per day. You take 60 seconds and you, for as many times as you can, click. I have a clicker right here and I just be like, smart, amazing, fantastic, stupendous. And I kind of go through like the comics of Superman, amazing, spectacular, and then once I get through that, I go somewhere else. But that's what you do. And every day you just try to beat your own score.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I'm from Indiana, so I'd like to think myself as a good basketball player. I don't know if I could self-talk my way into being able to dunk or not, but that's pretty amazing. Yeah, were there components of those interventions? That was another question in your research. Were there components that seemed to have more effect versus components that maybe had maybe in your findings neutral effect, or maybe weren't present and maybe uh, led to maybe like in your opinion less effect than what some certain components of other interventions had? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think that one of the things that is not talked about enough in the research is talking about how to teach somebody to detect a behavior because, Skinner talks about metaphorical extension and he talks about the environment teaching the individual how to tact feelings. Like when he says, oh, you got a boo-boo, that must hurt. And then oh, yes, this hurts. You know what I mean? So that's something that's only really talked about in a few articles. One of them I know is Kubina, Brown and Kubina 2022. And they talk about working with a girl with autism and teaching her how to detect the feeling that they want to detect. And that's something that I think can use more because that's something that I think is important to accurate data collection, which is super
Hmm.
important. But then once you get past that, the frequency building becomes easier. The being able to count becomes easier. A lot of these things are pretty simple to be able to do. It's just, do we have the amount of time? Because sometimes it can be difficult to tell somebody, all right, I want you to count all day. Okay, I don't know if I can do that. So, you can start at shorter
Yeah.
amounts of time and then maybe increase it over time. I asked my students, what is your most anxiety inducing class? For some reason, a lot of them said history, which I was like, man, I loved history in school.
Yeah.
But that's what I experienced. So I was like, okay, let's count in that class for just that amount of time and see what happens.
Yeah, I was a history minor. I love it too. But all I can think of is maybe the anxiety of, all right, on what date did this occur? Which I always thought was kind of pointless. Like, why do I need to know exact date? Just give me the
That's more like
time period.
math,
That's good
right?
enough.
But also maybe the
um,
teacher.
Yes.
Yeah,
No.
yeah. Taylor in the chat, and it kind of went along with what I was thinking too. Taylor said, I'd love to see this kind of intervention integrated into schools. This could have a huge impact on the confidence of kids. Um, and along those lines, I do see a lot of when I had clients who were in school, um, an attempt to teach emotions or an attempt to even teach like tacting of emotions, like, how does he feel? How does this person feel? How do they feel? Um, but always kind of falls short. It leads up to that moment of the kid screaming, "I'm not mad, I'm not angry," and like, well, clearly there's something going on there. So, yeah, I think that's a really cool pinpoint of like, let's, before we teach measuring this, make sure we know what it is we're measuring, which seems to be kind of elementary, but maybe that's an element we're missing.
I think it's real interesting how important being able to detect our emotions are, considering they are learned, considering it is, for lack of a better term, made up by the verbal community over time. Yet we see a lot of people that offend, and it's almost like they lack empathy due to the fact that they don't understand their own emotions. Once we teach them to tact and understand theirs, and then kind of pair that with the victims of their offenses, now okay, we can get a little bit of change. Like, all right, at least there's a punishment contingency along with the reinforcement as
Mm.
well, depending on what the crime is. So
Mhm. I mean, we have in psychology, we have the term psychopath, and that's one of the characteristics where if you have true psychopathy, and there have been people that like I've read books on this that are just really good scientific books, and they look at what are all the symptoms. That is exactly right, in that people just cannot understand and relate to that other person's pain. And so there's going to be
Mm.
lots of behaviors that are done. Again, this doesn't have to be like Dexter level of psychopathy. It could just be uh,
we
there are studies of people who like come in and like fire people and just have no remorse whatsoever. And there's all kinds of ways that that can manifest itself.
we see it a lot with sexual deviant behavior, people that are offenders in that way. Once we teach them, this is the level of fear that you've created. Let's find a situation that causes that fear in you, and then pair it with your victim. I mean, obviously, you can't say it works all the time, but we often don't see those people come back into the system, at least with us in the future after we've done some of that work. And so, I'm hoping to do some more research in that line, because if that's generalizable, that would be very cool to see.
Wow.
And
I've never even thought about that, but that is just remarkable to hear.
Mm.
and there are even people that we valorize that like this guy on TikTok that's been blowing up, John Kiriakou. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He's this ex-CIA guy who's been doing all these podcasts talking about his experiences in the field in like the Middle East, being in the CIA. And he talks about like he's gone through some incredibly like traumatizing experiences, as one would assume if you're like an undercover CIA dude.
Mm.
And he's like, I've talked to like a bunch of therapists, and they're like, I don't know how you don't have any trauma that's like exuding from you. And it's like, I don't know, I guess I'm just lucky. And it's like, well, that might be a level of psychopathy that I guess is beneficial, so we don't look at it as
Right.
harmful. But it's also like, where is the empathy, my friend?
You
Yeah.
wonder,
And
in that sort of case, was it not there in the first place, or did the military, because you're going into intelligence, kind of shape it out of your behavior to make it so you survive with the things you need to do?
So
yeah.
many unanswered questions, and it's hard. We can speculate
Right.
because we don't have data. And that's the thing with inner behavior, in why I get why I've been excited about it since I first learned about it back in 1994 and have been involved with it my entire career. There's just such a rich vein of data that we're missing out on because we're just not addressing it. There's the small community of precision teachers, and we are a really small community,
Mm.
very small. And when you compare us to behavior analysis, and I don't see people running with that kind of data. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people in behavior analysis that, like, there are clinical behavior analysts, and there's all sorts of people that do really good work. It's just different from this narrow band of research that Jared and I are engaged in.
Sure. Um, Kind of wrapping up here. Speaking to the last question in your paper, and kind of as you alluded to, Rick, what questions still remain about this topic? What research would you want to see happen, and what questions do we still have about private events and the measurement of them.
One of the biggest findings that I recognized when I was looking at the data on a few tables is that every single inner behavior study just does 1 minute timing per day. Now take a correlate in academics where it was like doing math facts timing sheets. Would you just do math facts one time and be like, all right, we'll try again tomorrow, or would you do it multiple times? You know, if you want the practice to improve your proficiency, you would do multiple timings per day. So that's one thing that I thought was interesting. I think that future research should look into not just 1 minute timing per day, but multiple, maybe up to 3, like we see at Fit Learning or we see at Morningside Academy when they do academics. Another one is an in greater variety in the population characteristics. There are not a lot of people of different races, ethnicities, look at different gender and then gender expression and neurodiversity and stuff like that. Like that, I think needs to be looked into as well, because I think that there's a lot of contingencies that operate on our environments. Like imagine people who are Latinx as ice rolls through. I know you're not trying to get political, but I'm just saying those affect your thoughts and feelings. So, you know what I mean? There are a lot of ways that your thoughts and feelings can be affected every day. So, you know, we have to think about how can we provide interventions for these different populations that are often underserved, especially in the literature. What do you think, Rick?
Those are great comments. I also think about our precision teaching community, and there are a preponderance of behavior analysts in that community. It's not made up of all behavior analysts, but there's a lot, because the adherence to strong data is what drives people into one of the things that drives people into becoming precision teachers. And I have done, at least at this part in my career, I've been fortunate that I've had my lots of different research topics that I've been engaged in, not just research wise, but also clinically. And shout out to a colleague, Kirk Kirby, who is bringing behavior analysis to sports. He's not the only one, but he's got a great company. And I spent some time working with him and others. And like he's got this, and he just has such these great ideas about for sports psychologists. Like sports psychology, if you are an athlete, you know, and you go to a sports psychologist, there's certain tools they're gonna engage in, and one of them is imagery. It feels very, what's the word I'm looking for without being insulting? Loose. How well does imagery work? I don't know. People will share some data around that, but if we look at counts of behavior versus imagery, that is just so, it just changes the dynamic of everything. And this is one of the things that I feel we need to do more of, about behavior analysis. Again, I can get into rant mode really easy, but one of the important facets of precision teaching is looking at dimensional quantities. That's how we should be examining the world. You know, frequency. Every behavior is a frequency. Every behavior is a frequency. I say that multiple times. So if that's the case, we should understand that whether it's inner behavior or outer behavior, public behavior, these frequency mean certain things. Like if we're having this conversation, and this has been a great podcast, everyone is respectful in this conversation. Everyone lets everyone talk, but we've all been in conversations where people interrupt, and that's okay. But if you interrupt me 5 times, you reach this threshold where you're annoying. If you interrupt me 10 times, I don't like you anymore, and I'm going to actively avoid you. So there are these counts that are associated with how we feel. And we don't identify what those counts are, but they're there for everything. And we just don't pay attention to those dimensional counts. And it's the same thing with inner behavior. If we started turning our methods to having people examine whatever those pinpoints are, and we started looking at, wow, what are those numbers, we would be able to understand, you know, what's a normal range, what's an abnormal range. Like Ogden Lindsley, Abigail Calkin is in an are 2 people that are in our community, and Abigail was Ogden's student. And she tells this story that when she started exploring inner behavior, one of Abigail's people that she was working with had this incredibly bouncy, variable inner behavior chart. And Og said, you know what? That guy is having a psychotic break. And sure enough, like 2 weeks later, this guy was in the hospital. So for Ogden Lindsley, to just understand this data, that it was so extreme. And again, this is assuming that, which is true, that this guy was accurately detecting these behaviors, could show that. I mean, that's remarkable. And I think in terms of future research, this is what we should look at. And all the issues of confidence, depression, I mean, you name it, rather than cede that to other people, let's try to understand how we can explore that as a science. And there could be things that we're missing. There could be improvements that we could have. But that's why you do science. And we have a small number of studies. We need a lot more studies. And what I just generally hope for our field is that, at least in this podcast, I hope people get interested in it. I hope people read Jared's paper and Jared's emerging body of work and some of the things that I've published and that other people have published, because maybe people will get inspired and try to do little projects, and then we can learn as the greater community of behavior analysts turns their eye to all of these socially valid behaviors. Okay,
Yeah,
there's my
what if you fix the yips? You know what I mean? You work on the yips or whatever Ben Simmons had. That would be amazing to work with, especially when it comes to sports psychology.
Yeah, I was gonna first mention that I interrupt Kyle all the time, and so he was actually keeping count at BAM.
I
how many
did
times.
have Bam. I counted.
Yeah, but I pay him to be my friend so he doesn't run away after 10. The other thing I just wanted to ask, because I know we're pretty much out of time here, but you mentioned the psychotic break. We do deal with a lot of people who have delusional behavior to the point that you can't have a normal conversation. Every conversation is very much, I'm Jesus, I taught the Beatles how to play. Like, it just like cycles. And all we're really able to do with those people, because of our limited time with them, is have staff shape, or the caregivers shape, okay, I want you to really get into the conversation if it's based in reality. And if it, redirect to something based in reality, if they start bringing something up not based in reality. But they're, because of the verbal behavior and how ineffective it is, we have to assume internally it's about the same way. Is there a way that you think in the future we could possibly measure it if they're not able to take a measure themselves or report the same way? Like, is there even something along that line for now if someone's nonverbal or just has some really complex intervening contingencies preventing them from being able to report?
maybe one day in the future, it seems sci-fi now, if you examine neurology and see the things that they're doing, like, oh, when you think about this area of your brain lights up. I don't know that we'll ever get so specific where an individual thought they'd be able to pinpoint that you're having, but maybe they could. And if they could, then that would, like, they're doing all of this. It's almost sci-fi stuff. If you look at the mouse models, like implanting memories and doing all this unbelievable things. So the answer is possibly, but to echo what Jared said earlier, I'm not a neuropsychologist. I read that with interest, but I don't read a ton of it. So I don't know what the horizon is. And is that just too sci-fi, or is it possible that we get to that one day? We might, but
I think,
I don't.
yeah, go ahead, Jerry.
And Rick went to the future. I'm going to go to the past. Lindsley did do some work when he was in I think it was a mental hospital is what they called it at the time. And he worked with like plungers and having people like press the plunger every time they like had a hallucination. And he was able to do like contingent seeing. I think it was something like that. Rick probably knows it a lot better than I do, but he was able to get them to distinguish and report between those hallucinations and actual events of real scene.
Very interesting. Yeah, up to this point, we've almost conceptualized it as, we know external verbal behavior as it's strengthened in the repertoire becomes internalized, when children are first learning language. And so we've gone with the assumption, and we've seen some progress, at least externally, that as you shape the external verbal behavior, that it would also strengthen that internal verbal behavior, or shape that as well. And so that's we've seen at least less utterances and more time spent in conversation based in reality with the people in the surrounding, but you just can't know without those reports. And that's why I think I find your research so interesting, is because now you are talking about actually measuring this rather than that Likert scale, or how are you feeling, or how many thoughts you think you're having, and rather than actually being able to measure it. So this is very cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And based on the trend of our time here, we could probably talk about this all day, but I am going to give our guests some respect for their time. Thank you, Jared Van and Rick Kubina, for joining us. The paper is Measuring Change in Private Events, a review of precision teaching interventions for inner behavior. Check it out in the new edition of Behavior and Social Issues. And thank you both for being here again. We appreciate having you.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank you.
And if you're more interested in standard acceleration chart and precision teaching, I highly recommend going to jaredvan.com/SCC. It's an opportunity for you to learn for free how to chart. And then I also have a chart on there so you can be able to chart data for free. It's not as good as Rick's platform. I'm going to say this is just a free thing that I just tried to make, but it will teach you about precision teaching to a pretty good degree.